So far, we talked about networks of friends. In our networks, links suggested positive relations. Some were stronger and others were weaker, but they were all positive. But pairs of people can actually have negative relations too. Sometimes there's disagreements or outright conflicts or antagonism. What we're going to do next is study networks with both positive and negative links. What we want to understand is how this kind of networks look like. We're going to start with very small networks, like a group of 3 people, and want to understand how typical friends and enemy relations work on very small groups, just 3 people, analogous to how we wanted to understand 3 people with friends, and triadic closure was one example of how that relation worked with 3 people. And in this case, once we understood the small networks, we're going to be able to see that it implies a global structure on how the network can look like. So let's start with some examples. So this is a little network here on just 6 nodes, and I indicated with plus and minus signs and colors of which relations are positive and which relations are negative. And this is the kind of typical network that we want to think about. To give you a context of where this kind of thing commonly arises, maybe one powerful example is coming from World War II, where countries somehow aligned themselves into alliances, and Germany was well aligned with Japan, and the US was well aligned with Great Britain, but World War II can be sort of as a tension between these 2 groups of countries. So in this case, the graph is not between people, but instead between countries. You can also think of this in the context of company relations, like, for example, the CEO likes one of the VPs more than the other VP, or maybe intensely has issues with one of the VPs, but it turns out that VP has a very positive connection with the board that causes tensions in a company's life. So this is another situation where some positive and some negative relations are present and have to do and describe a network structure. So we want to start with very, very small groups, just 3 people. Generally, we'll assume that we're thinking about a really small group, like such a company or even countries on the world, where every pair of countries or every pair of people in a small company do have some relations. Some are positive and some are negative, but they will all know each other. So here is a group of just 3 people. I think a very typical kind of group. This is persons A, B, and C, and turns out they're all friends. And we're going to classify this as a natural, balanced, simple relation. It's common in the world and just represents a group of friends. In contrast, if I think about this kind of relations, where C is friends with both A and B, but A, B have a tension or negative relations to each other, this is kind of awkward. It's certainly unpleasant for C, and maybe even unpleasant or awkward for A and B also, who, while apparently intensely disliking each other, have a shared friend. So we're going to classify this kind of relation as causing good group tensions or that it's unbalanced. And well, one observes in real-life situation that this kind of relations between 3 people often resolve themselves. Either C convinces A and B to actually become positive towards each other or become reasonably good friends anyhow, or another thing can happen, and it could be that one of the relations turns negative. So if you look at this network, there is negative relations of B, both with A and C, but A and C are friends with each other. If you think about this, this is also much, much more common. The way I would think about it is an antagonistic relation between one group against one person B. A and C lined up as friends, and they together dislike B. Also pretty common. And would think of this as a balanced network. It happens in real life a lot, and there's no reason this relation can change. It can go on for a long, long time, keeping this kind of relation. So we almost had all possible relations. There's one more left, I guess the all negative one, that is A, B, and C all instances dislike each other. And I'm thinking this one is also unbalanced. It's not really that it's unpleasant, particularly for anyone, in that other than disliking people might be unpleasant, but rather there's an opportunity here, an opportunity for two people to line up with each other. And if you think about this, I guess maybe one common example, so for example, A and C can line up with each other, and we can go back to the previous version where A, C are going against B together. So one common example to think about this kind of relation is what happened in World War II, where, remember, the US was, and Great Britain was also aligned with USSR. This is actually, with more recent hindsight, this is sort of harder to remember or explain, but I think you can think of it as they had a shared enemy, and they aligned themselves to work against the shared enemy. So far we went through the three little examples. We saw what are balanced and unbalanced triangles or relations of three people. And what we want to think about next is what are bigger examples of graphs with balanced and unbalanced relation. So one typical example of a balanced graph is where all relations are positive. This is just a giant group of friends. And indeed, every triangle in this graph is balanced. Another simple example of a really large graph, or arbitrarily large graph, where all triangles are balanced, would be a graph with two polarized groups. So I'm suggesting a graph here with A, E, F, and C are a tight group of friends, and D, G, and B also are two groups of friends. But these two groups are polarized. They're all negative on each other. There are many examples of this kind of scenarios in life, and just to mention a few from politics, you can think of these are the Democrats against the Republicans, or the pro-choice people against the pro-life people. There are many examples of this sort even in our everyday life. What we're going to ask next is what possible structures, what large structures are possible. What are graphs like when every triangle is balanced? Does that imply a global structure of the kind we just saw with two groups or just one group? Or are there other kind of structures possible or other big graphs possible that don't satisfy this structure?